Are these cycling myths holding you back from seeing progress when it comes to your cycling training, your racing, or changing your body composition? I'm Dr. Gemma Sampson. I'm an advanced sports dietitian. I specialize in nutrition for cyclists from amateur to elite. And having worked for a number of years in the field, there are a number of myths that I see people making when it comes to the way they're feeling in everyday life, their training, and in their racing that are perhaps holding them back from seeing progress. Today, I want to challenge you to start thinking about the way that you are feeling if you are being held back by these nutrition myths. So let's get started. The number one cycling nutrition myth that I hear time and time again is people saying that I'm riding so much that I can eat whatever I want. Does that apply to you? Do you think that if you ride all the time, you can eat whatever I want? Now, it's an interesting one because I think a lot of times when people are coming into nutrition with this mentality is that they are using exercise as a means to lose weight, which is all well and good. However, it keeps them trapped. It keeps them trapped in a position that they have to keep exercising because if they don't exercise, they're going to gain weight and they're not being able to maintain their weight without the exercise inboard. And I see this being problematic in a number of different ways because firstly, it keeps people trapped in the I have to exercise. And rather than viewing exercise as things more than just a weight management strategy, exercise is good for health. It's good for mental health. It's good for relaxation. It's good for getting anger out or frustrations out. It's good just to get outside as to be with other friends. There are so many benefits from exercise beyond purely just with weight loss. However, where I see this being also problematic is that it's a problem when people can't exercise. Because in cycling, for example, there are many situations where we might have to stop outside of our control. For example, if someone's had a crash and they've had an injury or they've gotten sick, you might not be able to physically exercise and get on the bike. And this is where this becomes really, really problematic. And I see it happen a lot where someone has had an injury, they've gotten sick, and they've kept eating the way they were eating before they perhaps had that injury, and they may have gained weight, or they start struggling with their food choices once the exercise is out of the arena. And so when I'm working with people, I always want to challenge people to get out of this, I'm riding so much, I can eat whatever I want mentality, because there's going to be a point in life that our riding capacity or ability is going to change. We might not be able to maintain 10, 15, 20 hours of cycling all year round. And when you've learned an approach that you can use whether you exercise or not and feel well in everyday life, plus the training around that, it's much more sustainable that when you go into an off season, you go into a period where you have to work and you're really busy with work, or perhaps you're injured, that you're able to maintain good food choices. So I talk a lot when I'm teaching people in my field membership and with my framework. We have our everyday nutrition, which is our baseline nutrition for everyday life and health. Our training nutrition gets added on top of that before, during, and after exercise. And then if we've got a race in the marks, then we're going to be practicing that in our training as well. When we start doing this, we're able to adapt and manipulate our food on a daily basis around the training that we are or aren't doing. And it keeps you from getting trapped in I have to exercise. If I can't exercise, I'm going to gain weight sort of fear. So that's the first myth that I see people having a lot when it comes to cycling nutrition. I'm riding so much that I can eat whatever I want. And I really want to challenge you on that one. The second myth that I hear a lot is that people aren't fueling training because they're saving their calories for later. It's one of those, again, it's one of those things that I see in practice. In theory, it sounds such a great idea. Okay, I've burned all this energy in my exercise. I've got all these extra calories. I can catch them up and I can save them for later. It doesn't work like that. And I find this is one of the biggest changes that I have to make with people is helping them to look beyond just the numbers. If they're tracking food, beyond just the numbers, the timing of when that food enters your body around the exercise that you do, it will completely change the way that your body uses it. What you're using in exercise before, during, and after is being used in a very different way to the same amount of energy hours after exercise, where it comes to the performance, the recovery, how your body utilizes it, how it's stored as body fat, how it's used to recover and build muscle and repair. It's going to be very, very different. And so when you start to learn how to add more before, during, and after exercise, there is almost always a deficit that you can then continue the rest of the day. And time again, I'm going to challenge you, if you aren't already doing this, is if you're finding yourself, you're finishing a ride and you're ravenous and you can't control yourself, probably it's because you haven't fueled enough before, during, or after that ride. Try something different in that ride and see how the rest of the day feels. Like, try it once or twice. If you notice a difference, then you can try a bit more, try a bit more. Doing that approach is going to show you a different way. When you feel more on your ride, you don't come out of that ride as hungry and then in a position that you're almost forced to eat more. And this comes from shifting your mindset around to fueling for performance and fueling those rides, fueling the recovery from those rides, rather than like saving it for later. And often I think it becomes a bit of like intentional binging sometimes, because like, oh, cool, I want to eat all this extra food, but actually it may not be serving you. And it comes back to haunt you when you aren't training as much, whether you're sick or you're injured or you're traveling or you aren't able to exercise as much. It starts to really unravel when you're in that mentality of saving your calories for later, because you tend to be eating more snacks and more food later in the day. And if the exercise isn't there, we habitually tend to eat the same way going forward. The third myth that I will hear cyclists talk about all the time is that I don't need to fuel this session because it's really easy. It's really easy. And again, I want to challenge you on that as to, is that true? And I challenge that for all of my athletes and clients to be like, okay, is that really true? And test it and to try something different, because even at very, very low intensity riding, running or swimming or whatever exercise it is that we're doing, we're still using energy. We're still using carbohydrate as fuel, often at a much higher rate than you were expecting. And so what I find and what I see in practice is that when people fuel those easy rides, especially if they're multiple hours long, because on average, most people are expending about 400 or 500 calories per hour during exercise, for endurance, for cycling, for running, for swimming, typically expending about 400 or 500 calories per hour. That increases the higher the intensity, the harder the ride. So even an easy 1 hour ride might be burning 400 or 500 calories an hour. That's more than 100 grams of carbs per hour. Like, I'm not recommending you go and eat 100 grams of carbs an hour in that easy session, but a small amount is going to influence how you feel, how you perform, and how you recover, and how the rest of the day plays out for you when you have sort of fueled that. We would be using more real food and more solid food in these easy, light, low volume sort of training sessions. And when you're adding multiple hours, so I'll see athletes that are doing a 4 or 5 hour ride, they've eaten nothing, they get home, ravenous, they eat everything for the rest of the day, and then the next day they're still tired and fatigued. Those easy, low volume rides, you have a bit of fuel. It might only be 40, 50 grams. There's still a deficit, but you get home from the ride, you're not as destroyed. You're able to then think intentionally, have a smart food choice, and then move on with the rest of the day. Plus you get to the next day's training session and you don't feel so tired and so fatigued because you've been able to recover from it better. The fourth myth that I'll hear cyclists making is that, oh, it's less than 2 hours, I don't need to fuel, or I'm going to wait until it's 2 hours into this ride before I start fueling. Big mistake. So typically when it comes to our glycogen stores, we've got more or less an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of carbohydrates stored as glycogen, which we can use as energy in our training sessions. Now, the problem is that typically we aren't going just really easy. And when we don't fuel that, when we get to, like, if anyone's hunger flattered, like, think about how fast you can ride when you hunger flat, when you've bulked, how fast you can run. Like, you can keep moving, but you're moving really slowly. Now, that is basically how fast your body is able to metabolize fat and turn fat into fuel for energy. So for me, I've done this on testing on labs in running and cycling contexts. It's around the hour and a half mark. It becomes basically a half marathon on the treadmill, and you finish the run and you feel really, really rough. You can keep moving, but then you can't keep that high pace and that high intensity. And that then has a flow-on effect with how your food choices, how you think, how you concentrate for the rest of the day. Now, when you are training, whether you are an amateur and you're going to work, I find when people aren't fueling these like easy sort of low intensity 1 hour, 2 hour rides, they are then just a little bit fuzzy and foggy when they go to work. Or from like my pro athletes who will then have to train 20-hour weeks plus, if they haven't fueled that, they then go into the next day and they just don't have quite enough energy to then hit those top numbers, and they're not really seeing the performances that they would be expecting because they haven't been able to fully recover from those easy sessions. Whereas again, those easy 2 hour sessions, we fuel with more real food, a little bit more fats, maybe a little bit more protein in there. There's still a deficit, but then we can carry on that deficit the rest of the day, which is, if weight loss is your goal, you want to be able to create sustainable deficits rather than like a big deficit that you then blow out later in the day or later in the week. And the fifth and final myth that I will see a lot of cyclists making on a regular basis is a mindset or a mentality that as long as I meet my macros, then I'll be able to lose weight, I'll be able to perform. And they're sticking to a really solid number. And often that number is way too low. The average person needs about 18 to 2,000 calories without exercise in order to sort of maintain a weight. And generally, what I find is when they've started working with me, they're typically eating at least 500 to 1,000 calories more than that if they're not able to maintain weight, or there'll be a timing thing, or there's a whole bunch of things that are sort of going on. A lot of us, even myself included, will typically underestimate how much that we eat or what's in a lot of the food that we're eating, especially if we've not really had much training about what is in food. And that's a lot of what I teach people to do, is to still learn firstly what's in food. And there's times we want more, and there's times we want less, and there's times where we want high volume, or there's times we want low volume. There's no right or wrong. But the thing is that if you're just eating the same thing day in, day out, there's going to be days that you're not eating enough, and there's going to be days that you're perhaps eating too much. And that's where it becomes problematic for you if you are trying to lose weight, is that if you aren't able to create the deficit on a sustainable sort of basis, there'll be times when essentially your body isn't getting enough nutrition to fuel what you're doing, which adds stress, which then affects cortisol, which affects testosterone from then, a whole bunch of other processes, which then can limit how quickly or how rapidly you're able to change body composition. Also then impacts your performance. So you're not recovering as well, and you're not able to hit those top peak sort of numbers. So it's this finding the timing around the training is what is the big game changer. You're going to need a certain amount of energy every day just to stay alive, to keep yourself healthy. And in our everyday nutrition, that is where we're adding the volume, we're adding fiber, we're getting vegetables and substance, and ensuring that we're getting enough protein and all these different nutrients to keep our body thriving and healthy. It's not trying to have the bare minimum. I love getting people out of that mentality of what's the littlest amount of food we get? No. How do we maximize what we're eating and look at how can we enjoy food and incorporate foods that we want to eat? And that might be the macaroni and cheese, rather than being I can't eat that, that's a bad food. It's okay, well, maybe if that's the only thing you're eating, it's not ideal, but what can we add to that to make it more nourishing, to keep the energy from perhaps going out of alignment with your nutrition goals, adding more veggies in, adding more protein in? What can we do to add to it rather than just take away from it? Then when it comes to our training, we add extra food before, during, and after the training at different levels, low, moderate, high. There's going to be different amounts of foods, different types of foods to fuel what those goals are. When you start playing around this, there is no one perfect fix. Everyone is different. Everyone's training is different. Everyone's goals or preferences are different. So it's not, a meal plan is just going to waste your time. So I'm not going to give you a meal plan because it's just setting you up to fail. And I'm not interested in setting you up to fail. I want you to succeed. And so learning how to fuel around the training, testing and experimenting, figuring out for yourself when you need more, when you need less, and how you feel when you've manipulated those timings around your training, that is how you create deficits that lead to long-lasting weight changes and body composition changes without compromising your cycling performance. Because then if you've got events, you've got training, you've got races coming in, rather than just waiting to race day, we're going to test it in our training and experiment and find what works for you, what products, what amounts, what frequencies, what consistencies, a whole bunch of different things. Tweaking and adjusting and testing and experimenting to find your perfect nutrition plan for everyday nutrition, race nutrition, and also your training everyday sort of life. If that sounds interesting to you, I would love to invite you to join my field team, my membership. I take you through this whole framework, help you to understand what you're doing, where you might be going rogue, and how to start adapting the way that you fuel to support your nutrition and cycling goals. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, fuel your ride, and I will see you next time.